Everybody's heard about the bird. Bird, bird, bird. Bird's a word. Well, a bird, bird, bird. Bird is a word. Well, a bird, bird, bird. Well, a bird is a word. Well, a bird, bird, bird. The bird's a word. Well, a bird, bird, bird. Well, a bird is a word. Well, a bird, bird. The bird's a word. Well, don't you know about the bird? Well, everybody knows that the bird is a word.
Welcome everyone to our fourth MennoNerds Hangout here. We got a small group starting off here. The invites have been sent out, so we'll see if other folks pop online as we go. We have joining us right now online and live, we have Jeff McLean from the Community House over in Lancaster. We have Myra Holmes from United States Mennonite Brethren Church. She's the social media coordinator. Christopher Gordon is one of our MennoNerd bloggers that will be popping in, just listening in here. And then myself, Rob Martin, a MennoNerds blogger and kind of the host and founder of this whole spiel here. So, welcome everyone. I see there's viewers watching us online. We've got some guys with the question and answer section over to the right. Just to let you guys know, those of folks who are watching via Google+, we do have question and answer opened up. So as we go through, as questions come up, if you come up with questions, go ahead and ask it by the fields to the right, and we will choose to answer questions at various points as we go. Those of you who are watching on YouTube, thank you very much for joining us, and glad to have you among us, and we hope that this is something you guys enjoy watching. As mentioned in the email and in the title of this particular Hangout, this is a discussion that we would like to have on denominations, specifically in this case the conventions and the conventions that go on with our denominations, the conferences that we have, and all those different kinds of things that go on, and to kind of help. To kind of help frame what we think we're supposed to be doing as the church in the emerging post-Christian world that we're living in right now. There were a number of questions that I sent out earlier, and welcome Tyler. Thank you for joining us. Generally, the first question I'd like to talk about, and this kind of continues the conversation we had a couple months ago, is as denominations, we occasionally have large group conventions where we get together in a particular city for particular purposes and everything. And I would like to kind of explore what those conventions have done in the past, why we have them, and then walk from there into what those conventions may hold for us in the future. Should we still have them? What kinds of things we should be addressing there? I don't think we have anyone online right now who is particularly involved in organizing this stuff, unless Myra, and unless you are involved in organizing those things. I didn't think so. But I know there are a number of us who've been to those conventions, myself included. So I'm going to open the question out first to the folks online here. What do we do with denominations and denominational conventions in the past, and what are we doing with them right now? As I said, I'm going to kind of start off this conversation. I've been to several denominational conventions. My history with the Mennonite Church involves a lot on the leadership side of things. My mother was in leadership in the church, and we did a lot of different conventions. I've been to Illinois and Oregon and Pittsburgh and Bethlehem and just a number of different Mennonite conventions and at various stages of my life. And what I've seen happening in the past has been a lot of church polity, discussions of business of the church, of the denomination in general, of the different things that we do as a church, and at least for most of the ones that I experienced, not a lot on the spiritual side of things. That getting together as a convention and talking about the business and the structure and the organization of the church, it doesn't seem like there's a lot that goes on in these denominational gatherings that address really the mission of the church, formation of the church, and those particular parts of being the church. Something else that I have experienced in these denominational conventions has been there's been at least in ones that I've experienced in the past, there have been these resolutions we put out, statements made out as a denomination that make statements of current events, things that are going on within the country, around the world, national policy, local policy, and basically creating position statements as a denomination to say, this is how we as a denomination want to speak to this situation. Pittsburgh, 2011, we set aside resolutions for that particular meeting to focus more on formation of it as a denomination, to focus more on what we're supposed to be doing as a church. I think Phoenix this year, they had a little bit more of that policy and politics involved, but again, still not quite to the level as what has been done in the past. And so, in my experience, it seems that a church denominational meeting, while there is certain necessity for organization, it just doesn't feel quite right if they're not actually talking about what we're supposed to be doing as a church, how we're supposed to form, what we're supposed to be doing, how we're supposed to be interacting with society. We can spend a lot of time talking politics and talking internal politics and external politics, but what are we actually doing as a mission of the church? So that's my take on church denominational conventions. I would like to throw this open to anybody else. If you just want to kind of wave your hand at your camera, and I'll focus the camera on you. I see a number of folks have joined us again. We've got Tim Nastig joining us down here, and Michael, all the way from Sweden. Welcome. Anyone else want to chime in on denominations and conventions and such?
I can tell you what the U.S. Mennonite Brethren are doing.
Okay. Go ahead.
One of my roles with the USMB is as a reporter for our magazine, and so I have attended a number of conventions. We hold a national convention every 2 years, and we are preparing to hold one in summer 2014. And our emphasis over the years has changed a bit. We do very little of the polity, the recommendations, the business. We do some reporting so that the people who attend know what is happening. And then we are emphasizing more inspiration, I guess you'd call it, encouragement. Bringing in a speaker or a musician or something like that that is family friendly, encouraging people to bring their families, and hoping the whole atmosphere of the event will be encouraging and uplifting and kind of a shot in the arm. Go out and get them. So a little different than the emphasis of yours, I think, Robert.
Yeah, sounds a little bit different. You guys recently had a conference like in the last year. We were talking to some more about your statements of faith and politics.
Yeah, yes, we had our Board of Faith and Life hosted a study conference to deal with what we call Article 13 of our Confession of Faith. That's the one that deals with what it means to be a peacemaker. And we've been processing that now for a long time. And at the convention in 2014 this summer, our Board of Faith and Life will be bringing a recommendation for a revision to that article based on the feedback they've gotten over the last 18 months or so. And we'll be tweaking it a bit. We won't spend a lot of time at convention on that recommendation because we've processed it at the local church level, at the district level, at various levels throughout this season. So we're hoping that there won't be a lot to discuss. We'll know where we're going with it. But yes, we will deal with that recommendation at our convention coming up. Okay. Does that answer your question?
That's perfect. That's exactly what I was looking for.
Okay.
Anyone else want to chime in? Tim, you're in MCUSA as well, correct? I'm not picking up your microphone.
All right, so I'm Charlita, Tim's partner, and hi everyone. I'm thinking about this question of the spirituality in gatherings, and in many ways that is present in conventions, but there's something of the spirit in it. I think we can. Huh?
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
What was that?
Oh, no, I was just speaking to my friend, sorry.
Okay.
So, something of the spirit, we can stay a bit cerebral as Mennonites, and I was able to participate in a Church of the Brethren young people's gathering, and I'm feeling that lack of gathering of peers, 20, 30 somethings, to have, unique worship and had a folksy feel, which I love, but yeah, remodeling what worship can look like in the middle of all our angst and questions and recovering from that. So yeah, just something to be learned from the pietist tradition without losing a lot of our values, just integrating them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You want to have anything, Tim?
I would say my really positive experiences at conventions has been the last 3 conventions, first in Columbus, then in Pittsburgh, and then in Phoenix, really working with the Pink Menno group, which is I don't want to share a lot about it right now, but it's a group of people with really strong shared values from within the Mennonite church body. And I think that is one of the spaces that these conventions can provide, is people who work together around shared faith and values and look for ways to bring about change in the broader church.
Okay. All right. Anyone else in the conversation want to add? Jeff, Michael, Tyler, you guys want to add in anything?
I'd be curious, does anybody know the history? I don't think I've ever read any history, but the history of what conferences have been in the past to the Mennonite Church as we started networking as a denomination?
I see Tim waving his hand here. What do you got?
I had a really interesting conversation with, I remember talking with Mary Ellen and Al Meyer, some of longtime Goshen Mennonites, and they talked about going with their whole family in a camper van to these big tent, almost like a tent revival feel. And I'm not a historian, but it was just that image of the big gathering under a tent. The gatherings were smaller, so they were able to be held on college campuses, not these big convention centers, which always are a practical necessity in some ways, but bringing with them a certain amount of soullessness, I guess, or they're meant to hold people, and air conditioning, all that kind of thing. And whereas the smaller gatherings had a more like, we're going to have a big camp together, have these big worship services together, and just talking with them and hearing those stories gave a very different sense of the origins of those conventions.
Okay. Now, Michael, you're in a kind of unique position here. You're the non-Western, the non-American person in this group, and I'm not quite sure exactly what kind of conventions or denominational structure you're involved in out there in Sweden. Could you give a little bit of a sharing on what you're involved in with larger church bodies and everything in your neck of the woods?
Yeah, definitely. Everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we got you.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'm trying to get a camera as well, but it's not working. All right. In Sweden, we don't have any Anabaptist denominations at all. So what we did was to create an Anabaptist network a couple of years ago. Me and some friends. It was perhaps 4 or 5 years ago, something like that. Because there's already an Anabaptist network in Britain, so we got inspired by that and started it. And I've been thinking a lot since the theme is denominations of this Hangout about the pros and cons of denominations. We live in a time, at least here in Europe, where denominations quite losing their role, especially among the younger generation. People really don't care about denominations very much in the church, and there are still lines between different theologies and different practices, but they tend to cross denominations. So what used to be this uniting factor is not as much like that anymore. And the question is it good or bad if you want to promote Anabaptism to have a specific Anabaptist denomination, is the fact that we have a network and not a denomination good for the Anabaptist values in this country? And I don't know the answer to that. But what I've seen is that, for example, pacifism is quite common in the Swedish churches. I will not, try to guess how many Christians are pacifists here, but there are a lot across all different social denominations, and that's not only caused, of course, by our Anabaptist network, but influential theological leaders here in Sweden are inspired by that, and it could be caused that Sweden generally politically is more progressive than, for example, the United States. But I think it's really interesting, and I was so glad to hear a sermon at a big Christian youth festival a couple of years back, which is hosted by a charismatic church, and the sermon was clear pacifist message, and it has impacted a lot of the younger generation. So that were my initial thoughts on this topic.
Okay, so there's not really an Anabaptist denomination of sorts in Sweden, but there is this Anabaptist network of Sweden. Do you guys get together a little bit more? Do you get together in larger groups, or is it still just more like a very loosely formed network?
It's very loosely, and it's quite small as well, but it exists, and we have published a few books by Stuart Murray, the leader of the Anabaptist network in Britain, and try to inspire different forms of church leaders, but it's still very loose and quite small. We've met a couple of times.
Okay. Well, thank you. Tyler, I know you have been working with some folks on trying to build some kind of network structure as well on a broader Anabaptist perspective. You want to share a little bit about what you're talking about with that?
Yeah, so across the country, independent of one another, there's been a lot of movement towards communication, sharing of ideas, learning from each other, in the context of Anabaptist and Neo-Anabaptist movement. So it was of particular interest to me, so I started reaching out to people, and I discovered that other people were doing the exact same thing. So we started conversation, and it's just been exactly that. I mean, there's been people from the greater Chicago area that are kind of post-evangelical, that are associated with the Missio Alliance, who identify as Neo-Anabaptist. Myself, having grown up as an evangelical in the Southern Baptist Convention and coming out of that into Neo-Anabaptist ideology and theology, then of course, I mean, it's just all across the spectrum. I mean, whether it's from a liberationist bent that I happen to be particular to, as well as Tim, to others that are planting churches in the East Coast and on the West Coast. So the hope was to try to build a network that was very similar to what Stuart Murray and the UK Anabaptist Alliance network was doing, over the last 15 years or so. So I have a lot of high hopes for it. I think it's something that can be para-denominational, and I like to use the term para-denominational because it can work alongside within for denominations while not having the red tape of the denomination. So it's just it's something that somebody could be a part of without feeling that they have to be in a denomination, but they can also reap the benefits of what each denomination is good at. So, for instance, if one denomination excels at church planning or at Christian education or publishing or what have you, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. If there are Anabaptists and Neo-Anabaptists that are in network with one another, then why not plug what one is looking for into something that a denomination is very good at. And if there's a need somewhere, if there happens to be something that none of our denominations are good at, perhaps we can communicate and work towards filling that gap with with something of value. So that's kind of the big meta-narrative picture there. So a lot of excitement, and we've had a lot of people come into the conversation, and I hope that it continues.
All right. Well, one of the things that we talked about in our last conversation about denominations is one of the good things that denominational structures bring to the conversation has to do with forming around common values and common ideals. I mean, the reason why you have Mennonites and why you have Lutherans and why you have Reformed, other than some of the historical nastiness that goes along with those particular structures, is that there are certain common ideas and common confessions that these different groups gather around. So there is some sense of that going on with denominations and denominationalism. But we also talked about, as Tyler was pointing out, a need to be able to go cross-denomination, para-denominational, and be able to build ministries and build relationships so that people can communicate across those boundaries. So on the lines of the larger gatherings, conventions that denominations have and larger groups have, for example, in about a month, Eastern District Conference and Franconia Conference are having a joint assembly, our annual meeting, to get together. And again, as a conference assembly, it's going to be primarily business, primarily budget and how these churches are doing and how we're going to handle certain structures or certain questions of a conference-wide concern that we're going to be dealing with. But I'm wondering if there needs to be more of the kinds of gatherings that it seems like we're hinting at here. Tyler hinted at gatherings that are para-denominational and cross-denominational, where we get together and talk about things. Tim mentioned the gathering within a gathering with Pink Menno, and gathering together around a common set of ideas and a common purpose, not necessarily for the point of policy and polity, but more for spiritual growth and even taking that spiritual growth and moving outward with it. So I guess the next question I would like to kind of throw out there for anyone to respond to is, when it comes to denominations, which seem to have some good side to it and some bad side to it, what is the level of importance to denominational gatherings in the changing culture and society around us? Do we still need to have those larger, broader, church-wide gatherings like we have coming up for MCUSA in Kansas City in 2015? Is that still a necessary type of gathering for us where we are right now? Is that something we see continuing in the future? What's the role of those kinds of gatherings in the church today? What needs to change, and what kind of things should they still be existing? So throw it out there. It's a very broad question. So Tyler, yes, go ahead.
Sorry, didn't want to jump in too quickly, but as I was hearing there, I was just thinking, good, bad, or indifferent, as long as there are rules that can be amended and people's lives are affected, as long as there's wealth and a distribution of wealth in our denominations, we'll always have a need for denominations. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. In other words, you mentioned Pink Menno, and just as a brief example of Pink Menno, although there was an opportunity at the conferences to get together, and there was worship and there was networking, at the end of the day, they were there for a polity issue. And as long as conferences, as I was hearing there, I was just thinking, the most common one is going to be the distribution of wealth, whether it happens to be towards education or planting churches, what have you. Publications, I think there's always going to be a need there, and it's the same with ordinations. As long as we have ordination processes, we have to. I mean, that's just it's kind of the it's a hamster wheel, sort of. You have to jump through these hoops because you have the hoops there, if you see what I mean. So I'm not trying to discourage conferences, but I see no change in that as long as we're feeding them. I think they're going to be just as active in post-Christendom.
Okay. Anyone want to add to this? All right, Tim?
Michael mentioned the Anabaptist network in the UK, and I think that's a great model to consider. I worked as a full-time volunteer for them in 2004, and then continued to work with them in the UK until summer of 2006. And I was consistently impressed by the way they said, this world doesn't need more Christian organizations or institutions. We want to be focused on relationship. Part of that is a factor of scale. They're a much smaller group of people, and they each have their. They now, in the last 10 years, have developed an Anabaptist network of congregations and organizations, but at that time it was largely individuals in their own churches, whether Baptist or Quaker or from a variety of backgrounds.
But, and they do a double-barreled denominational affiliation, so like Catholic Anabaptist or Lutheran Anabaptist. So.
Mm-hmm. And so that makes for kind of a, the original, that was the Mennonites who first went there on doing mission work, Ellen and Eleanor Kreider, really went with that idea of salt and light rather than starting a new denomination. And so I think it's an interesting example, especially because that's where some of the post-Christendom writing has come. The Anabaptist Network started focusing while I was there on publishing books around Christendom. So you have Politics After Christendom by members of the network, or Mission After Christendom, or and so looking at that context. And so I think that's an exciting model to look at carefully, and it's really great that we have Michael here from Sweden able to speak to that experiment there.
Anyone else want to join in? And again, those of you who are watching that are not actually in the video call, they do have the question and answer session open on the side, so you can throw up any questions you want to, and we'll bring them into the conversation as well. Yes, Jeff?
The thing we have to remember is our denomination in MCUSA is a well-oiled machine. And as long as a denomination stays as a machine, we need these conferences as a way to continue our board meetings and make the votes pass on how to keep a machine alive. It keeps people indoctrinated with the identity of a company, and it keeps the idea that the machine is needing these meetings to refuel itself. So maybe the bigger question is there a future for our denomination if we want our conferences to be more meaningful?
Okay, that's a good question. I mean, just kind of thinking about that. I mean, there's two conferences going on right now that are getting a lot of press. There's the Act Like a Man conference with Mark Driscoll and the Strange Fire conference with MacArthur.
MacArthur.
Yeah. I hear you. But I mean, that goes beyond denominations itself. If I'm reading them correctly, those aren't denominational conferences. They're conversations around an idea.
Are they conversations, or are they in top-down conversations?
That's an interesting perspective. They're more top-down. Here's what we believe, and we're going to try to indoctrinate everybody into this line of thing. Not as much a conversation as an indoctrinational session. That's a good point.
Because the root word of conversation being to convert. That's what I mean. So
yeah,
I don't see them being bendable.
Yeah. So I mean, it seems that even outside of the idea of denomination, there seems to be this need to gather as large groups to talk about things, and I think those kind of conferences that are going on right now seem to. I have a problem with them in that they are that top-down kind of conference. They are, all right, here's the idea, and we want you all to agree with us, and we're going to try to indoctrinate everybody into getting to agree with our kinds of things. Whereas it sounds like, and then Michael, you can kind of chime in on this. What's going on already in post-Christendom Europe and those in the areas over there is that instead of having conferences and conversations to try to talk down, it sounds like there's a lot more relational networking going on. And Tim, you mentioned that about an Anabaptist network in the UK already. So, Michael, maybe you can speak to this. What kind of things do you see moving in the direction of having some of these more relational group conversations going on in Sweden? If you want to kind of give any feedback on that.
Well, I would not, automatically say that just because you have a topic that you want to discuss and teach others that would be something bad. I totally disagree with the thesis of Strange Fire, but
obviously from your articles.
Yes, but I wouldn't say that it's indoctrination per se, and that having this teaching. I'm very inspired by the Vineyard movement, and I have an analogy when it comes to the charismatic movement, because John Wimber, who started that movement, he never wanted a Vineyard denomination in Sweden, but instead he wanted to impact the larger body of the church. Now, my pastor wanted to start a Vineyard, so he talked with Wimber, and eventually, Vineyard Scandinavia started. And today it's one of the smallest denominations in Sweden, and they gather around 1,000 people. But then we have the New Wine movement, which was started in Britain in the Anglican Church, and then it has moved on to Sweden and becomes this trans-denominational movement, and they gather a lot more people, and it's the same theology, is this Vineyard Kingdom charismatic theology, but it's much more widespread and so on. When it comes to the Anabaptist thinking, as I said, it's very common in Sweden, but we don't have many conferences on the topic. We have this small relational network, but somehow I think it's mainly happened that many Christian leaders here, they feel very uncomfortable with the conservative Republican evangelicalism that we see much about in the U.S., while many of them are still theologically conservative, so to say, and they are evangelical. So we have developed this combination where even evangelicals and conservative Christians tend to be more progressive when it comes to political issues, and I can't really see any big conferences that talk about this. What I'm involved in when it comes to peace and justice from a Christian perspective, it is very relational and very small scale, but a lot it's happening, and it seems like most people tend to believe this anyway. There's not so many conferences on the importance of believing in the resurrection of Christ, because most Christians believe in that anyway. And somehow, even though Anabaptist values are definitely not as widespread, but many people still think that peace and justice is good things, and even pacifism has become very widespread. And I'm not even sure why, but I haven't been involved so long either. I've been a Christian for 7 years. So yeah, that's my response.
Okay. Thank you. Tim, go ahead.
Robert, I appreciated the examples you gave of, I don't know much about Strange Fire other than seeing Mark Driscoll's ambush there, but you just summed them up as conferences coming together around doctrine. And network like that I've been most a part of over the last 10 years is Christian Peacemaker Teams, which is a community that gathers around praxis and practice, which to me has a different, brings about different kinds of gatherings. So 2 years ago, we gathered in Chicago to celebrate our 25th anniversary. People from all over the place, many different stories, many different denominations. And it makes for some interesting experiments. Like in a month, we'll be gathering in Georgia, November 20 to 24, in conjunction with the annual gathering at the School of the Americas, a vigil that's been going on for more than a decade, or 2 decades perhaps. And there we're saying, we don't have to have a gathering of our own. We can gather alongside. We'll be attending that vigil and also doing our own event. So I think there's a lot of creative possibilities there that can get outside the convention bubble, perhaps.
Okay. There's a comment from Paul Walker that came up here. and since I have you online here, Tim, I wanted to hear your response to this. He just moved to England about 2 months ago, and it's not a question but a comment about that he's really pleased to hear about the Anabaptist network in the UK. Can you give a little bit of more about how that network works relationally, about how they are networking together, what kind of communication structures or anything like that they had going on? Because that's obviously of an interest for him, but I think it might be a model for moving forward for stuff here in the United States as well.
Yeah, it's funny. This is the MennoNerds gathering. So one of the major ways I got involved back in 2004 was building Anabaptist Network, AnabaptistNetwork.com, I think, or .co.uk. I don't have it on the top of my head. But one of the tools we built at that time was a map of the study groups around the UK. So understanding that our communications online can facilitate local gatherings. So those were, in Bristol, in York, in London, or different parts of London, just where people got together once a month to study together, to build relationships. And then every 2 years ago, probably twice a year or so, there would be national gatherings as well, where people would, usually 30, 40 people would get together at a retreat center and just, connect with one another. And that was also right during the transition from having a journal, Anabaptism Today, that was published in paper form, to moving to books and more online focus. And so they've worked hard to try to adapt. And also, Noel Moles and Stuart, who you already mentioned, have both made efforts to figure out how can we share this model across the Atlantic. So we helped organize a speaking tour for Noel, including going to the Mennonite Convention this past summer. And so those are ways that vehicles they're using to build those relationships and try to adapt. Yeah, what would you add, Charlene?
Just a MennoNerdy tidbit that Noel Moles helped to come up with the title Naked Anabaptist.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying a word more about Noel, because his approach is really interesting. It's just called Workshop, and he's been running it for 30 years with a group of other Anabaptist-minded folks. It doesn't consciously label itself Anabaptist. I sometimes jokingly refer to it as crypto-Anabaptist.
Subversive Anabaptist.
And it's really a lay discipleship course that happens on a year cycle, and that's, again, adapted over the years. But Charlene and I both participated in it.
Monthly gatherings, extended weekend-long studying, homework assignments in between, small group gatherings within that, and then going through a kind of pretty comprehensive collection of thought and resources on areas of ethics, the broad story of Scripture, and church and worship practices. I think there might be a fourth one, but yeah.
And that they didn't even, say here you have to join anything. Lots of those folks were just part of their own churches and never even joined up with the Anabaptist Network. But they went away with a sense of not just what is the right doctrine, but how do we live, the ethics and the discipleship that are at the heart of Anabaptist practice.
Very cool. Thank you. Myra, I wanted to bring you in here for just a second. We're doing a lot of social networking and everything like that with the Google Hangouts. Twitter has been one of the ways that we as MennoNerds actually got started in the first place and everything. So there's the big physical gatherings that we have, and you said you've been a reporter in them, but you're also the social networking coordinator for U.S. Mennonite Brethren. How do you see that relating to how denominations confer with each other, how we communicate ideas, how we share practice and praxis with each other? Do you want to give some information on that? Because that seems to be also what's been going on in the UK and what's been going on in Sweden and other post-Christian areas. So can you share a little bit more about your experiences in that?
How about something like the MennoNerds? we could hang out online together and talk. I think our social media efforts have concentrated more on bringing we're a small group, and we're very scattered. We have churches in North Carolina, in Montana, in South Texas, in California, and we're very diverse ethnically. We're very diverse theologically in some ways. And so it's very important for us to just connect. And so our biennial gatherings are partly just that relational connection. The conversations that happen over the coffee break, I think, are just as important as anything that happens in the formal meeting. And I think our social media serves that function as well, just a way that we can connect across geography and across. We're not as good across the ethnicity yet. We'll get there. So it serves as a tool within our denomination for that. Outside, we're still exploring. You know, I think MennoNerds is a great start at that. A great way we can talk to each other and learn from each other.
Excellent, thank you. You're waving your hands down here in the corner. Do you have something to say? We're just appreciative. All right, gotcha. Jeff, you're doing things a little bit differently down there in Lancaster with intentional community, with the community house, some of the other things that you're doing down there. Again, thinking we've got a denomination, you're involved sort of with MCUSA and with being a pastor and everything, but you're also, I mean, you mentioned that the symposium you had with Mark Steenwick this past weekend actually brought in some atheists, some young, some old, some agnostics, a whole different kind of mix of people coming in. So can you share a little bit more on your experience on that and how that relates to this kind of new idea of thinking relationally about our gatherings?
Yeah, that's a deep question, I think, just to answer off the cuff. But I believe in creating conversation, and as part of the community house, one of the things that we say is we believe in the power of story. And so we say we're becoming intentionally creative about the way we live in our neighborhood and the way we create conversation in our city. That's kind of our tagline. And so what works for us is just how relational we are. I don't know if that works on such a national and international scale for networks. I think with gatherings like this, they are important. The conversation we had with having Mark in town was important. We've done other ones with other authors and topics. I think what it is what makes MennoNerds and what makes the community house work and the Anabaptist Network is everyone has an equal voice. And maybe we need something to serve as a great equalizer within a larger picture. But I think there's power in where people can walk into an event or a meeting and feel that they are able to share what the Spirit's put on their heart and what God's made them passionate about. I've never attended a larger gathering much more than I've had to out of being asked to be part of something. But if I didn't make Pittsburgh, I didn't make Phoenix, because I don't play well with politics, and I see the power of these events for networking. You know what I mean? Even in Mark's event, and I apologize to Mark, because as we had him in town, I felt like I was in the back, like shaking people's hands that were constantly talking during the same time as Mark to me, like introducing themselves to me. So there is power in everyone gathering, not only for conversation, but be able to network and sharpen each other. So yeah, I don't see the need to cancel the idea of national and international gatherings of community and conversation. It's probably just a way of becoming more, as we say, intentionally creative about them, and where everyone feels equal to share.
I think that idea of multi-voice gathering, I think that's an important thing. I'm hearing that kind of across the board here, of people wanting to be able to have conversations where everyone can speak, everyone can have a voice, everyone can actually have a means of participation. I think I heard Tim. That was one of the things that came out of the Pink Menno involvement, at least with Phoenix especially, that there was a moment there, if I remember correctly from the articles that I read coming out, there was a moment there where Pink Menno actually did, for a time, have a voice there. And regardless of where you come down on the side of the issues that Pink Menno deals with, it is important for them to have a voice. And I think that's something that, as we start looking at how we relate to each other, whether denominationally or with a cross-denominational, para-denominational network, or whatever you want to call it, I think it's important to make sure we have these broader voices and a much more relational way of communicating with each other. Yeah, Christopher Gordon over here just throws up on the chat that more than just equal voice is the idea of even a lack of control. That we brought up the topic of the Strange Fire Conference and the Act Like Men Conference, and there was very much a level of control there where they controlled the conversation, whereas what we're aiming to do with our MennoNerds blogging network and what we're trying to do there, and what I'm hearing a lot of the rest of you talking about, is reducing the amount of needing to control the conversation and letting the conversation happen, letting people have a voice and letting people talk. Anyone else want to kind of chime into that? Am I ringing any bells here or whatever? Go ahead.
I would definitely agree with you there, Robert. It's about empowerment. It's about enablement and agency for people. I mean, because, and I think especially in a post-evangelical, post-Christendom America, I think those who have been brought up in the church have been brought up in a hierarchical manifestation of the church. It's just inescapable in the United States. Michael talked about it a little bit, from his perspective in Europe. It's the same thing when you have conversations with those who are agnostic or atheists. They can see it from the outside looking in, and they see these structures of control where it's not really about enablement. It's about indoctrination, or it's about a broader like entertainment, factor. And even though it may be ideological, the participation is very limited. So I think as long as Anabaptist, Anabaptism, if you will, as long as we're focused on enablement and affirmation of people's gifts and agency, then the only one that's in control is the Spirit, and all we have to do is be sensitive to the movement of the Spirit and participate. I mean, that's really it, and it's a beautiful thing to see, and it's something that you can do for free, and it's something you can do within a denomination, outside a denomination. It doesn't matter, and I think what's so beautiful about it.
Excellent. We're running out of time here. I promised you guys that we'd be done by 5 o'clock, so you can go watch your football games, hang out with family and everything. Did anyone want to have any last-minute comments or anything that you wanted to say to share with the rest of the group here? And feel free to just kind of wave your hand again and let me know, and we'll go on from there, and then we can wrap it up. Yes, Jeff.
Just out of curiosity, so we kind of have this little, how do I want to say it politely, complaining session in about the future of conferences. So the reality is, no matter how, we may all come on the same idea of we need a great equalizer, we need to have conversation, but the reality is our machine isn't there yet. Mm-hmm. And in the meantime, what does it mean for each one of us to see the need for change, and how do we live that out as we have this conversation? What does it do to us, or is it just a complaining session?
For my part, can you hear me?
Who's speaking?
This is Chris.
Okay, go ahead, Chris.
Hey, Chris.
For my part, being out in the hinterlands and not having any corporal Mennonite or Anabaptist fellowship, it's not my responsibility to change everybody. It's my responsibility to change me. And that is my contribution to the change of society. Both the Christian group that I'm trying to influence, as soon as I try and control them, I've stepped outside, as I see it, the bonds of Scripture. I am obligated to change me and to walk the way Jesus wants me to walk, and call people to follow that example.
Yep. One of the things that I attempted to do with this particular conversation, so it wasn't going to be necessarily a gripe session or complaint session, was invite some people who are in power in the denominations. I know, Myra, you're not exactly in the upper echelons of USMB. I did invite Ed. He had to decline. It would be cool to have him with us. But I also, William Metzger from Mennonite Church Canada was supposed to be here with us today. For whatever reason, he wasn't able to join us. And Irvin Stutzman from Mennonite Church USA was also supposed to be with us today. But again, he had a flight cancellation or a flight rerouting or something for something he's doing in Topeka today. So he wasn't able to make it. But I think that this is a first step. Myra can take her experience here to Ed and to her folks and say, there's folks out there talking about relational conferences where we're actually talking about what we're doing and how we're living and how we're working with each other. And this video is going to be published online, and we can throw this out there for other people to view the conversation we're having about what it means to be living in relationship with each other in these larger gatherings, so that we can start changing out the wheels of the machine. As Jeff put it, we have these machines that are running. How do we retool the machines to work differently? We've got a different culture, different society around us. Either the machine needs to be retooled to meet the new world around us, or the machine needs to be dismantled. We have the machine now. Maybe we need to do some retooling and look to replacing it someday with another machine or another way of doing things. But I think that's where conversations like what we're having here, this is where it starts, to start talking and revisioning and rethinking about not just complaining about what things are, but to rethink things. And Tim tossed up here a key thing to not start our own machine in the first place, is where maybe design a movement as a garden. Good point. One of my buddies, Scott Roth, likes to talk about the idea of churches are like greenhouses, and you have things that grow in the greenhouse and grow all nice in the greenhouse, but sometimes you throw a tomato outside the greenhouse and the seeds plant elsewhere and grow and build something new. So maybe that's something that we're going to start seeing more of. We've got people who are coming up in the church, but then are not satisfied and end up being planted outside and start growing something new, and we'll start seeing other ways, other gardens growing, other